Just kind of recapping a little bit from last week. The first screen I had up last week was God's strategy through history, and this kind of summarizes our approach when we look at history. There are really three things that I'm trying to establish in the process of the flow of history, and sometimes it can get lost along the way because there's so many events happening along the way that I want us to be sure to keep the big picture. The big picture is we wanted to see what we saw and talked about quite a bit last week was the rise of the early church. And then the second thing we looked at, we started heading into the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, as they're often referred to, or medieval period. But anyway, so what we have to remember is no matter how dark it got and no matter how much truth, the truth in the Word of God was suppressed for hundreds of years, that no matter how dark it got, there's always light that's somehow preserved. There's always a remnant. There's somebody that still gets it. And so we'll begin to see that. But there was a while there where it was a little bit hard to tell. I mean, it was just really, really a difficult period. That period, that 600, 700, 800 years where the Roman Catholic Church suppressed the access to the Bible. It's a really, really hard time. And so people don't have the information, they don't have the light, they don't have the understanding. And so when you look at the history, where we're looking at the Roman Catholic Church, when we're looking at 500 AD, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, when we look at that period, it's real easy in the process of it because it morphs over time. As you see the handout that Jeanette's handing out right now, which is kind of the history of the Catholic Church, and where they interjected really false ideals, false teaching along the way over a period of almost 2,000 years. They just never stopped. Here's another weird thing we can do, and so. But in the middle of all that, it's very difficult. We know there are true Christians somewhere in the middle of all that darkness, but it's very difficult to tell who they are. Because the only thing we have as a representation of the church for a period of a number of hundreds of years is the Roman Catholic Church. And as it morphed, it became more and more pagan over time. The first 100 years, when we're talking about Constantine and the shifts that began to take place by the time we get to Augustine, which you see on the sheet, it begins to be more... it just gradually gets more and more pagan. And as it gets more and more pagan and it becomes unified with imperial governments, it becomes much more difficult to kind of find out where the true believers are. And then you have this suspicion that the true believers, were they to rise up, are going to be persecuted by what claims to be the true religion. And that becomes a real problem, as we're going to see. So the rise of the early church, no matter how dark, there's always a remnant. The sequential restoration of the church is where we're going to head eventually. And that takes a number of hundreds of years for there to be a restoration of the church as we know it today. And aren't we happy about that? I wouldn't trade anything to have been alive during the Middle Age period when the Bible was suppressed, mercilessly suppressed. And so that was tough. So we're looking at basic periods. We looked at 330 AD to 314 AD, the first 280 or so years of the early. That's what I refer to when I say the early church, that first 280 years. Then we have 314 to 500, the rise of the Catholic Church. Doesn't mean that it was fully Catholic yet. You begin to see the semblances come together of what we refer to as the modern Catholic Church. By the time we get to 500 AD, where they've instituted infant baptism and so forth, it really begins to look like the Catholic Church. So then we have 500 to 1,000, the early Middle Ages. We see the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire by Charlemagne by the end of, as we get closer to 1,000, around 800 AD. And that begins to, actually the Holy Roman Empire continued for hundreds of years. Its territories and parameter would change and flux, and new emperors would come and go. But generally speaking, for several hundred years, they would refer to this era as the Holy Roman Empire, and it had a large swath of what we call Europe today that was part of that empire. Then we have, the High Middle Ages, 1,000 to 1,500. That's where we're going to be heading today. And then 1500 to 1700, the late Middle Ages, or the period of the Reformation. And then the 1700s into the end of the 20th century would be the Great Awakenings and Revivals, sequential Great Awakenings and Revivals. So I want to speak a moment, as we are moving past 1000 AD into the era of the Holy Roman Empire. You have to realize from a Christian, I say that in quotes because I don't really think of them by this time as a real, true Christian religion. There is so much corruption now, and as you look at those introductions of all the corrupt things that they were doing. But during this time, and as you'll see, you'll believe me when I tell you what they were doing and what they started doing, but 1184 to 1832 were the era of the Inquisitions. They don't like to talk about it. If you go to the Catholic websites, they'll have a spin. And there's a lot of opinions about how many people they killed, how many people they burned at the stake, but I can just tell you it was a lot. So any organized group that was non-Catholic was considered heretical by the Roman Catholic Church. And they were also, because the Roman Catholic Church was in league with the state or the Holy Roman Empire, they were also considered enemies of the state. There is the Unholy Alliance. This Holy Roman Empire, it instituted extreme measures of torture. It could be used to get the accused to say or confess to what the inquisitors wanted to hear. So if they wanted a guilty verdict, if they wanted a confession of guilt, they would get it by torture until they got what they wanted. There were 4 major periods of Inquisition that lasted during this period. The most famous period that's referenced often is the Spanish Inquisition. That's one of 4. You have to remember, there's a lot going on here. So in the beginning, the Inquisition would target Jews that were supposedly insincere Catholic converts. That was kind of how it got rolling. And then later, it began to target Protestants. Protestant, think of the word Protestant, protest. Okay, so Protestant comes the idea of those who are protesting the abuses of the Catholic Church. And so then they began to turn on people who were objecting to the Catholic Church or becoming Protestant. So, but you have to also recognize during that period when they begin to turn on what we refer to as Protestants during the even pre-Reformation period, that these were often the true believers. These were often people that loved the Lord, and they really had a walk with God, and they were starting to get their hands on Scripture one way or the other. They're getting their hands on the Scripture, and the way that's happening is some of their own authorities or people within the clerical ranks began to break ranks. And that's where the Achilles heel was, because those guys had access to the Greek and the Hebrew, and they knew how to translate it. And so once those guys started to feel the grief in their spirit that the people do not have access to the Scriptures in their own language. And so sure, maybe there's a Catholic Bible in a church, and it's got a cathedral, and it's got a chain attached to it, and it's Latin. But the common language of the people is English or German or Bohemian or whatever. And it was meaningless to them. Because nobody knew Latin. Nobody spoke Latin anymore. That was the Roman era. So in 1252, the Pope Innocent IV, who's the Inquisition Pope, I call him, officially sanctioned torture as a way of extracting the truth from their suspects. But this is really scary if you think about it. And these are supposedly the Christians. And that's why I look at this and I say, these are not believers. These are not Christians. They do not have the Spirit of Christ in them. They are political, demonized entities that are, after complete control, and they're authoritarians and totalitarians. They do not believe in freedom. Nothing like what we think of today as freedom. So now leading into that, I think I had a comment here about the Inquisition. So let me go ahead and move ahead. You'll notice in your guide, and I'll move on from the Inquisitions, but it says on down in the sequence because it's by dates. 1478 is when the Spanish Inquisition was instituted. It lasted from 1478, believe it or not, to 1832. The Spanish Inquisition extended to all areas of Spanish influence, South and Central America and Europe. They had a lot of influence back then. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, in league with Pope Sixtus IV, instituted the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is said to have burned 2,000 people at the stake within the first 10 years. Over the course of its history, the Spanish Inquisition is said by some to have tried 341,000 people, of whom 32,000 people were executed. So what you have to realize, and you can do some research and look at it online, but the methods of torture were just inconceivable. They were absolutely beyond comprehension. The means that they, and I could sit here and elaborate to you the different methods. It was a very barbaric era anyway. But the tools that they use, and my understanding is there are kind of chambers and museums and things you can go to and see a lot of their tools of torture. You know, I was in Mexico a few times, and they would say, well, no, all that stuff's in the basement. Once in a while you talk to a missionary who'd actually seen it. But they actually have those chambers still deep under those old cathedrals. The cathedrals there are 400 or 500 years old, so it overlaps with the Inquisition period. There's a real thing. So we have to, that's why I'm under no illusions when I think of, I will never be able to be very warm and fuzzy with the Catholic Church. I can be warm and fuzzy with individual Catholics. You understand, there's a difference. But the system itself is a pagan system. It is a false religion. That's what I actually think. That's what I really believe. And now it's on live stream for the whole world to see. The 5 people that are on there right now watching. Hi. Still love me? Okay. All right. So now we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to move into 1300s. Keep in your mind, in the background is this Inquisition thing going on. We move into the 1300s, and that would be a period, a precursor period for the Reformation. The Reformation was the great protest against the Catholic Church. It's when various leaders began to step out, and through writing or Martin Luther was the first one to publicly protest all these things. And actually, I think I mentioned it last week, but on that Catholic list, almost all those things were in the Reformers' protest, if I recall, except for infant baptism. They kept that one, so they didn't have it in their list. So the precursors of the Reformation, there was some real trailblazers. John Wycliffe would be the first one. When he died, he wasn't burned at the stake, but when he died, he was declared a heretic. And they wanted to dig up his bones and throw him in the river. I mean, they really, really hated Wycliffe. We named the Wycliffe translators after him. He's one of our heroes. What he did that was so awful, that was so unforgivable, was he translated the New Testament into English. It's a really scary idea. And it was extremely controversial and against the law. Hard to believe. He also rejected certain Catholic doctrines, like transubstantiation. That was one of the ones that he didn't agree with. He was critical, very critical of the Catholic corruption, which Martin Luther identified as well. John Huss is the next one I'm going to mention. He was executed. I believe he was burned at the stake, strangled. But when John Huss died, he'd be an early, pre-reformer. When he died, as a result of his death in the Bohemian part of Europe, 3 wars erupted. 3 wars, all because of John Huss. After he died, I think maybe the wars surfaced maybe 10 years after he dies, but his followers rebelled against the papacy. One of the things he he would teach us, you can't obtain forgiveness by paying money. You have to obtain forgiveness by repentance. That was one of the things John Huss would teach. It was so revolutionary, so radical. And he also turned out, in the beginning, him and Wycliffe were kind of at odds with each other, but in the end, he ends up taking Wycliffe's writings and republishing them and copying them and circulating them. That got him in a lot of trouble because those writings were also forbidden. So that's John Huss. And then as we move a little further, we have 1452. We have the Gutenberg press was invented. I should have brought you my little document. I have a document printed that I was able to do the actual mechanical arm. There is no existing Gutenberg press of the original ones. They're all made of wood, and so they didn't survive, but they would be replicated. And so the one that I saw in, I forgot where it was. Huh? No, it was in Europe. It was in the Gutenberg Museum. It was in the Gutenberg Museum, which I'm trying to remember what city it was. Certainly, anyway. But anyway, I was able to actually make a copy of the first chapter of John with the Gutenberg press. I had all the little typesets and so forth and pulled the lever. And there were 30 people and they picked me. I felt like it was like God giving me this chance, like I'm drooling over this thing. I'm wanting it bad. They could probably see my eyes watering, like I want to touch it. And so, but as slow and meticulous as this press was, and all the little letters that they had to line up, and for each page of the Bible, it was just. But the fact is, they could print 10 Bibles in the same time it took to transcribe one by hand. So even though it's very slow, it is a revolution. And so they start making these machines and circulating them all over Europe. And they start printing all kinds of stuff, among which is the Bible, but they start printing all kinds of leaflets and ideas. And so you have to realize this is the era just pre-Reformation, but it really was an invention that was very needed to begin to put fire behind the movement that was underneath the surface, just ready to erupt. Soon after, the Gutenberg press, you have 1457, the Moravian Church began, and that was John Huss's followers. Started the Moravian Church. Moravian Church had a big influence on John Wesley. I know I'm throwing names out, and I'm hoping you know what some of them are, but as we get to them, I'll explain who they are a little better. So then we have Martin Luther. He symbolizes really the beginning of the Reformation. Martin Luther, he posted his 95 thesis on the Wittenberg, Germany cathedral, and it just created... Now you have to realize Luther didn't intend to start a Lutheran church. He just wanted to help his fellow brethren in the Catholic Church come to the light. He wanted to help them come to a recognition and repentance and put pressure on them by making public all the stuff going on that everybody kind of already knew, but were playing along with. And a lot of people in their own ignorance are just doing all these things out of almost superstition. So then also in 1517, we have the rise of the Anabaptist church. Now these are not Southern Baptists. These are not independent Baptists. These are the people that the Mennonites, the Brethren Church, the Amish, these are the people that spun off of the Anabaptist movement. And so you have to understand the Anabaptists, these are purists. They just see they've gotten their hands on a Bible. And I mean, they start reading it for themselves and they said, you know what? We need to follow the book. And guess what they decided? Reading the Bible honestly, decided that biblical New Testament baptism is submersion underwater by people who make a decision to follow Jesus, not infants. Remember how they institutionalized infant baptism to such a point that they obsolesced adult baptism. So that now infant baptism is the only means of baptism. And so these guys are saying, hey, that's not even biblical what you guys are doing. You've lost your way. And so they start their own church. They start a movement. And guess what? They're considered heretics because they're not part of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, they have a problem because neither are they part of the Reform movement. they kind of are in a sense that they're part of the revolution that rejects Catholicism. But they're more of a renegade group. They're not. Okay, so they were more the radical Reformed movement, led by Zwingli. And so the Brethren Church in Holland would be a spin-off of the Anabaptist. Jeanette was a part of the Dutch Reformed Brethren, right, Jeanette, for a period? And also, they also had early Pentecostal experiences known among the Anabaptists. The presence of God would come, and they would have manifestations, speaking in tongues, healing, all these types of things were part of the Anabaptist movement. There were signs and wonders. They were huge early advocates of the risky idea of freedom of religion. That's the Anabaptists. They were persecuted relentlessly and ruthlessly by the Catholics. But the sad thing is about the Anabaptists is they were also persecuted by the Reformers. Remember, the Reformers would not give up infant baptism. So the Anabaptists were now rebelling against the Catholic Church and the Reformers, and they simply want to obey the Bible. It's really remarkable. So under the Spanish Inquisition and King Ferdinand, those guys, I don't have it in my notes, but I know that they murdered thousands of Anabaptists. And they did it, they called it the second baptism, and they did it by drowning. They would hold them under the water and drown them, and they did it to thousands of them. I think, if I recall, it's 2,000 of the Anabaptists, and they were hunting them down. And the Reformers were hunting them down. It was a Catholic side that did that massive killing of the Anabaptists. But the Reformers also burned people at the stake. And so it was a rough time, man. You want to be a true believer, and, it's kind of like, oh, Christian man, where are you going to run to? Oh, true believer, where are you going to run to? Where are you going to hide? And it was rough, but nonetheless, there was a period, an era of very courageous people. And I think you also have to kind of recognize how much darkness they were coming out of, how much suppression of the truth they had been subjected to for hundreds of years. And you look at some of the things the Reformers did, you think, oh my goodness, how could they even be Christian? And it does make you wonder. Some of the things that Calvin did, it makes you wonder. But if you read his writings, sometimes he seems to have a genuine love for God, So, but man, when it comes to their merging with civil authorities and civil law, they could be really rough. So Anabaptists are a good case in point. William Tyndale dies at the age of 42. He also was an awful, awful person because he dared translate the entire Bible into English. And that was 1536. He could speak 7 languages. So that's what I'm saying about these guys from the inside are troubled. They are stepping out with courage, and they are the only ones that know. They're so literate, they have all this language skills that they can actually do it. It's not like the common people could do it. There needed to be somebody on the inside that would step out and go, you know what, I can translate this, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to get it to the people. And that's what Martin Luther did. He translated the Bible into German, which again was forbidden. It put a death sentence on him. So, William Tyndale knew Hebrew and Greek fluently. He was tried by the Catholic Inquisition. He was strangled. He was strangled and burned at the stake. William Tyndale. What an awful person. I mean, I know it almost makes you sick, doesn't it? When you hear and you realize the reality of the history and how dark it was. All right, so let's look at the effect of the Reformation. 1545 to 1620 is generally kind of considered the Reformation period. As much as there were things about the Reformation that we might not care about, they introduced a number of things that were very important in creating a shift. The one thing they did is the Catholics no longer had a monopoly. It's very important. They broke up the power base of the Catholic Church. And if you've ever visited Europe and you go in some of their museums, you'll see they'll put maps up. You can get them online, but they'll put maps up and they'll show which sections went Reformed, which sections remained Catholic. And I mean, they literally went to some fighting civil wars over this because the territories, depending on church affiliation, had to do with civil government as well. And so they would fight. And I think Switzerland, a lot of these countries you don't realize, but it was intense. And so when I was there touring some of these communities, I would ask my guide, I said, so how do you tell a Reformed church? How do you tell which churches? Because a lot of the Catholic churches were converted into Reformed churches depending on how it spread. And so they would change, they would get rid of a lot of the statues and things, and so they became very characteristic in their style and their difference. And there was something about, maybe somebody here remembers that there's a rooster on top of the church. And if the rooster is, does anybody know this about the rooster on top of the church? Huh? Something about the direction they're faced or the style of rooster or something, but that it's a dead giveaway. That's a Reformed church, that's a Catholic church. Something about the rooster on top, the golden rooster on top. Somebody can look it up, tell me later. I just remember at the time touring these places. All right, so some of the characters that were really people you hear about when you hear about the Reformation, you hear about Calvin, John Calvin. You hear about Martin Luther, which you've already mentioned, and Zwingli, who we've already mentioned. So these would be three people that were really movers and shakers when it comes to creating a lot of change and taking territory and really beginning to make a lot of changes. One of the things, even though the Reformers held on to Calvinism very aggressively, and which is Augustinian. Remember last week we talked about Augustine? Okay, so Augustine he was really, I know it sounds odd to call him the first Calvinist because Calvin wasn't born yet. And the reason is because the Calvinists adopted their views from the Catholic monk Augustine, and they kept those views even after they rebelled against the Catholic Church. And so a lot of those views, to this day, there are people that very, very much believe in the Calvinist ideology. We're going to get to that eventually. Let me watch my time. Okay. So in the Reformation, some of the positive things that were brought was they brought a very strong work ethic. And they believed, they came with the idea that work is sacred. That it's not like you have a secular part of the world and a sacred part of the world. They began to realize that if somebody is a shoe, making shoes or repairing shoes, that he is doing a holy thing. And so that led to, very much so, to a more capitalist view of economy. And so they deserve a lot of credit when it comes to understanding how freedom began to get a hold in especially the northern European countries. So work becomes sacred. The concept of reinvestment was also very important that they developed. So capitalism, freedom, even though they didn't leave all the trappings of Catholicism, some of the things that they introduced were very good, even though they could be brutal at times toward their own heretics. So let's move on, and this is where it gets really interesting. In 1560, Jacobus Arminius was born. You ever heard of Arminian thought, Arminian theology? A lot of people throw that around, but they don't necessarily know the history of it or how it came about. Okay, so Jacobus Arminius was born in 1560 and died in 1609. What's really amazing to me is how young some of these people were when they died, but how much an effect they had on history. It's just, he was 49 years old. I hadn't accomplished anything at 49. I didn't even accomplish much to this day. I mean, as far as when you think of how an idea takes hold and changes the world, Jacob Arminius, John Calvin, Martin Luther, these people got a hold of an idea that created a revolution and changed the world as we know it today. And so, it keeps in, there's these tug of wars between these different kind of slants or worldviews concerning theology. And so he was a Dutch theologian, I just mentioned. He was a Calvinist. I know the irony. Jacob Arminius was a Calvinist. He taught in a Calvinist university. And he began to be the kind of the spokesman for what became the Dutch Remonstrant movement. And those guys had a way of getting out of dungeons, I can tell you, because I'd go to these different dungeons and they say, well, they had these 5 remonstrant guys in here and they all got loose. They don't all get loose. Some of them would get, burned at the stake, but a lot of them would get loose. And my friend who was with me, giving me a tour of a couple of the castles, a Dutch friend of Jeanette and I's, he was saying, these are your friends. He knew I'm Arminian. We'd argue back and forth about Calvinism. He thought I had the best arguments he'd ever had to deal with concerning. He says, you make some really good arguments. But he said, these guys escaping, these remonstrant guys, they are your guys. They're not the Calvinists. They are your guys. They're not my guys. But you could tell he kind of had a respect for them. They were escape artists. Couldn't. So anyway. You probably heard me in a sermon tell the story about the guy that was in the dungeon. Well, anyway, he escaped. He put together a bunch of cloth and jumped out of the window. And he was so skinny because they'd been depriving him of food so bad. He went out on the ice, and he could cross the ice without falling through. Well, the guards are following him. And he's on his way. He is scot-free, right? And I forgot his name, but I'll probably work this in a sermon sometime in next year. But anyway, it's such a great story. And when I was there in Holland, I saw the church and I saw the tower where he escaped. And my friend is telling me, your guy was in there, and he is like a folk legend to all the area because he escaped and he got on the ice. He gets all the way across the lake, and the guard chasing him is heavy because he's been eating well. He falls to the ice, and our guy turns around. He goes, help me, save me, help me. And so he turns around and goes and helps him and rescues his guard. And so then there's the religious whoever on the bank. And the guard's going, well, I should let him go, shouldn't I? I mean, look, he just saved my life. And he goes, no, capture him, bring him in, put him back in prison. So they put him in a better prison. And they burned him at the stake. And they had green wood, and the wind was blowing, and they said they heard him screaming for hours and hours, and the whole countryside could hear him tortured by that green wood, that burning. So that's what they could do to people. And it's very sad, but these very courageous people, like these Dutch remonstrant Arminians, were really amazing people, because they were also like the Anabaptists. They were stepping out and they were saying, you know what? So here's what happened to Jacob Arminius. So he's teaching in the university. So he starts questioning some of the beliefs and starts relating some of his students. He'd meet with some kind of small group meetings. So anytime you think nothing much happens in a small group meeting. He would have these small group meetings with his students, and he would talk to them about, I really don't think it's unconditional election. I think it's conditional. I really don't think it's, that grace is irresistible. I think that it can be resisted. I think there's a choice involved. And he started emphasizing free will, and he started emphasizing, so they start saying that makes a lot of sense. So all these Calvinists start turning to Arminian thought. So they call him in. They call him into the tribunal or whatever, the inquisitors. Now, these guys have all learned by now that it took hold in a very aggressive way. And to this day, now you have to realize how big of a change that is, because the Arminian belief or viewpoint was an inspiration to missionaries. The Calvinists, they didn't have a natural affinity to missions because, whoever will get saved. It's all a matter of faith. It's all a matter of God's choice, not their choice. So what difference can we make? In the long run, people will figure it out on their own. And so, but the Arminians had a very different view about missions. And so you have the Moravians, some of these others came along, and that's where some of these early missionary movements came from, where they felt like, we need to rescue people. We need to give them an opportunity. We need to get them the truth. So you see the rise of really who are the true believers. And so Jacob Arminius continued to develop his ideas and began to convey them. I think he did some writing. But in the long run, he dies, as we just said, at an early age. But his movement, his ideas continued. It took hold like fire. And so one of the people that took hold of his ideas was John Wesley. So So no longer, once it starts spreading, do the Calvinists have a monopoly in their realms. See, before it was all Catholic or all Calvinist. And now all of a sudden you have a Arminian stream taking place. They're still a very small minority. But you know what they are now? If you were to say how many churches in the United States are Calvinist versus Arminian, do you have any idea what the ratio is? It's probably a 2-to-1 ratio Arminian to Calvinist. Get to so many exciting things when we talk about the revivals and the... All right. So with the Reformation comes the scientific revolution occurs simultaneously with the Reformation. Really interesting. And I know Francis Schaeffer believed that the Reformation brought about the release of the Bible, the Gutenberg press. I feel really hot, so do y'all feel really? Let's check it. Yeah, it's a little hot. Preaching the fire. Is that what it is, Logan? Thank you, buddy. I hope so. I'm giving it my best shot here. All right. Where was I? Okay. The scientific revolution, which you'll probably see it here, it's thought to have started around 1543, and you'll notice the Reformation at 1545. So they literally were happening simultaneously. Isn't that interesting? So modern science, as we know it today, was a result of the free dissemination of knowledge. The printing press was the first thing that had to happen. There was like a perfect storm. All these elements started to come together. You already had this kind of inventive spirit taking place in the late Middle Ages. Remember I said they invented eyeglasses and they started using paddle wheels and developing artillery, and all this cool stuff is coming about. So they were beginning, the awakening was beginning to happen. A lot of times you don't realize an awakening is happening. It may not be revival, but sometimes an awakening is happening even when it expresses itself through natural things that are occurring. So when huge tug of war taking place. And it's hard for us in the middle of it to see kind of what's happening and how it's going to shift or what it all means. But it's nice to look back and we can look at his more about faith in the Bible than he did about science, but yet he's the greatest scientist. So these early scientists, there was no disconnect for them between their faith and science. It was all the same. In fact, it was their faith that inspired and motivated their science, because they believed that if God is a God of order, He is a God of design. And so therefore, as we explore and try to understand the universe and chemistry and physics and all these things, then there are systems of operation that can be discovered because God is a God of order. And that's how they were motivated. Great scientists. Now, on the upper end of the scientific revolution would be Louis Pasteur, who lived from 1822 to 1895, who... You know, you guys, many of you have been around me at all. You've heard me talk about Louis Pasteur. He's one of my heroes. But the fact is that he'd given tremendous grief over his rejection of Darwinism. And when Darwinism was a new, hot, philosophical, scientific topic of his day, but he never budged on it, and it infuriated people. But Louis Pasteur was a great scientist. So, simultaneous to this, I was in a museum in Europe, and there was a comment which showed this big map and all the changes and realignments and all this, and it had a statement on it that said, I wish I'd taken a picture of it, said the Enlightenment was not possible without the Reformation. I thought, wow. So, the reason I'm pointing out the parallel between the advent of the Reformation and the advent of the rise of modern science, and then coinciding with that is also the Enlightenment. In other words, free thought could thrive in a freer environment. And so some of the Reformed cities had more freedom. And so you would see freedom beginning to develop and beginning to take hold. The Magna Carta and some of these things began to lead to greater freedom. So when we look at freedom, speaking of 1600, 8:15. 15 minutes of discussion. I was going to talk about Samuel Rutherford, but I would do him an injustice. When we talk about free thought and ideas which shape the future of really, of America and Western civilization, Samuel Rutherford. So we'll cover him next week. I think that's the right thing to do, is just make this a part 3 next week. So was that enough food for thought? Did I give you brain overload? So if you guys have comments or questions, we can do that. Yep, we'll run a mic.
So I have one question I'm curious about. The Inquisitions and stuff that went on for so long. I know they were very, very bad. But do you think there was like any silver linings? Because this kind of forced people to really examine the Bible, and it really, like, under pressure, kind of like the diamond was formed. You know what I mean? So do you think there's some truth to that, or it was just completely
well,
terrible?
they didn't have the Bible. That's the problem. Now maybe if there was somebody on the inside that had the Bible, but I could see maybe, and we're speculating now, but you'd probably have to do some research on this, but I would think that the horrors of the Inquisition may have caused people to recoil. And they were like, we're afraid of these people. We're afraid of the Catholic Church. We're afraid of the Catholic officials. We're afraid of our neighbors because they may turn us in if they don't like us. And then, well, there's no due process, and they're going to call us into the tribunal, and we may end up being tortured next week. It was an awful thing. But I do think it may have inspired, this may be a silver lining, is the idea of due process. That would be a classic example of where due process was sacrificed, but where it became very much a part of Western civilization. So, yeah. Others?
My question is, you were talking about Sir Isaac Newton and Louis Pasteur. Where do you think the disconnect now between scientists and their faith? Where and when did that happen, and why aren't scientists? Because you the famous scientists now are so like against God and the belief of a higher being. They're like, where do you think that comes from?
Okay, that's a really good question. I think part of the challenge we have, and why there's such a dichotomy between science and religion, if you will, where they're almost antagonistic to each other. You have to also recognize that there are many, many scientists who are not atheists or agnostics. And in fact, I think medical doctors, for instance, they'd be scientists, were interviewed, if they're family practice doctors or they're surgeons or they're treating patients, they tend to be theists by like 80%, overwhelmingly theists. Where the agnostics are and the atheists are the professors in the university setting, lab workers and things. I mean, but the people working with people tend to be people of faith, by and large. So I think the dichotomy developed because, like many things in our culture and society, they have essentially been taken over by a more, I say leftist. I mean, I think before it was leftist, it was atheist, it was agnostic, it was Darwinist. Darwinism really laid the foundation for all the leftism that we have today. And so, and what was characteristic of the Soviet Union and communist countries in North Korea is atheism. And what's the rationale behind that atheism is Darwinism. And so the shift took place. Darwinism took on great popularity. And in the 1800s, after Origin of Species was published, and it became kind of a battle of ideas. Do we accept this, reject it, and then how do we teach in the schools? And there was, the Scopes trial and some of these things. So over a period of time, we kind of lost that battle in the public square. To this day, I mean, it's kind of like if you were to run for a political office and it came out that you were a young Earth creationist, you would be, they would use that right there. That's a nutcase. So, but I think it's shifting. I think that we are seeing a shift, and part of the reason is, that the creation movement has been led by scientists, not by churches, not by pastors. It's been led by scientists who begin to see the evidence and see the facts, and they go through a process of waking up, and they realize, I've been taught, I have a PhD from this university and so forth, and a lot of these guys, they're really brilliant scientists. And a lot of them kind of keep it a secret because they could lose their funding, they could lose their position, they could lose, especially as they're in academia. But anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an unfortunate dichotomy that's really not necessary. As our early scientific founders proved to us, it's not necessary. And if I gave you the full list, I have a list of 100 scientists that would be the founders of modern science. They were all Christians or theists at the very least. It's an endless list in every specialty, in every area, all the way up into the 1800s. So, good question, though. Meandering answer. Anybody else?
This list on the false doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church,
Yes.
this thing is still alive and well. Almost every single one of these.
Exactly.
I mean, do they really believe all this stuff? I mean, still, right?
Well, I mean, it's a very big religion. There's a lot of subscribers to it. But I think you have to keep in mind there are people that would say they're Catholic that don't necessarily subscribe to all that.
Really?
This is the system,
Yeah.
the Catholic system. But especially like if you look at the charismatic Catholic movement, a lot of them have kind of, not entirely, but a lot of them have kind of left some of this to the wayside. They began to be out of rest about praying to Mary and doing the rosary, things like that. So they start to back off some. But they remain in the Catholic Church. Catholic Church has been really effective over centuries of absorbing dissident groups and ideas, but never changing their position.
Yes. I guess the majority of people that I go around, even up to since yesterday, I was with a friend who's a Catholic, and she told me about praying the rosary and all this kind of stuff. And then the other time was about Mary, and another one that wanted to give me holy water from Lourdes. So I don't know, it just seems like it's still rampant.
How can you be a good Catholic and not subscribe to all those things?
That's what I mean. It's like a
No, I
great
know.
deception.
It's and somebody who wants to, begin to break away and begin. But listen, I mean, I could ask right now, how many of you were brought up Catholic? Let's see your hands.
Me. Only two.
Oh, not that many. I thought a lot more of you would raise your hands.
Really?
But I mean, I can tell you more broadly in our church, there's a lot of people that were Catholic in their background. Only 3 of y'all were Catholic in your upbringing? You were kind of?
I went to Catholic private school when I was a child. St. Peter and Paul in New Braunfels.
Okay, well, this is unusual, really, that there's as few of you that were brought up Catholic. Marcus, in your family Catholic? No? Okay, I don't know why I thought that.
The main Lutheran church still believes in the infant baptism. In fact, it was kind of a touchy point with my parents when I decided to get rebaptized.
Ah. Yeah.
Where in the Bible is that baptism?
It's not in the Bible.
So how are they saying that this is?
Well, there was a rational thought that developed the idea. And the original rational thought, Augustine articulated it pretty well, but that was the belief that babies are born sinful and they're born guilty. Okay? And so therefore, how can we ensure if a baby dies, or 1 or 2 or 3 years old, how can we ensure that they're going to go to heaven? And so the belief was that the church, with the authority of the priesthood and so forth, could baptize them with holy water, sprinkle that water on them, and all the stuff they do in their ritual. And that somehow that would secure that child and they would become a member of the Catholic Church and secure them for heaven if they were to die. And so that's the way everybody was getting baptized by the time you get to the 5th, 6th, 7th century. But that was the rationale. It was all based around their concept of original sin.
So to receive communion, for instance, I was baptized in the Catholic Church.
Uh-huh.
I had my first communion in the Catholic Church and my confirmation and all that kind of stuff that I
Yeah.
didn't even understand. But would they, like, if you were not receiving communion in the Catholic Church, could you receive communion if you went to a Catholic church? Do you know?
If I went into a Catholic church, they
Right.
would not want me to receive communion because I'm not a Catholic.
Even
They
though
would
that's not
refuse
the
me
whole point
communion.
of communion, right?
Huh?
That's not the whole point
They
of
would,
communion.
right, but they would refuse me communion. You also have to realize their communion is not the same as our communion. They believe in transubstantiation, which you would know this.
Yes.
But that is the idea that the
It's really
bread and the
body.
wine become literal bodily tissue of Jesus.
Yes, and
So it's called the sacrifice. Some of them may not know this, but it's called the sacrifice of the Mass. And so all over the world on Sunday, continuously, we're re-sacrificing the blood and body of Jesus as we take communion together. So their communion is very heathen, very pagan. It's non-biblical. It's not even the same thing, even though it looks similar. It's not the same thing as what we do
Yes.
in remembrance of Him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jaron.
Two things. First thing's really fast. I received communion at a Catholic church. I've never been Catholic, but I was a child. But it was at a relative's. Was my cousin. My cousin got baptized as a baby in the Catholic Church, and they invited all believers to receive communion. And I went. Anyways, we won't talk about that experience, but it's weird.
Was it a charismatic Catholic
No.
fellowship?
Not that I'm aware of. It's very odd to have someone put things. That's
Well,
very
you know,
weird.
I think
It's
one
weird.
thought about that is that the Catholic Church in the United States, because evangelicalism and Protestantism is dominant in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
that they don't always show their true colors. And until you go into some of the other third world countries, they show their true paganism there.
Right.
And it's raw paganism.
For sure.
But here it's very suppressed and very polite. And they've been to some extent influenced by Protestant Christianity here and tempered some of those things. But they still do all the things you just said, Sue.
Sure.
I went about maybe 6 years ago to a Catholic church because they, I was visiting friends. They were my friends. I went to church with them. I brought Seth, and very politely, they just, before they tried to show me the missalette that said basically only Catholics can receive communion, and she was trying to underline so that Seth wouldn't go up to get communion.
Right. And
I
I've had that
actually
conveyed to me
felt-
too. Only Catholics come and they have a certain line for them. But Jaron was in a more lenient house.
I was, apparently. It was in New Braunfels. Anyways, okay. So my second thing is, I'm curious. I'm going to go real controversial. Have you seen the documentary Spotlight?
Yes.
Okay.
Scary.
Just-
And, and the Catholic Church, that's another thing I should put in the list. Well, it is there.
Where?
It's the celibacy rules.
Right, yes.
And that has fomented innumerable sins and secrecy and all kinds of shenanigans among nuns and priests and all this stuff. And the documentary she's talking about, I think it even has 2 parts, doesn't it? Spotlight. But it's
I only saw one.
it's the systemic. Every church can have scandals,
Right.
but the systemic nature of the sexual molestation scandals in the Catholic Church are second to none.
Right.
It's just unbelievable. So
there's a
we're
whole
we're bashing
online-
them. We're bashing them pretty bad tonight. But
It is what it is. There's just like this whole thought online, this whole big discussion that you can, if you go
I'll
real
bet.
deep into the interwebs,
Yeah.
and people, there are a lot of people who assert that it's not accidentally caused by the celibacy vows and all this other kind of stuff. There are people who assert that it's on purpose. And that it's just because if there's so many things that are heathen and pagan that they're doing,
it's darkness.
who's to say that it's not on purpose?
Right. It's tremendous darkness, demonic, idol worship. All of it is
Right.
is dark, very dark.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a lot of Catholics in my life.
There
that I love.
were
Okay.
large alignments with the Catholic Church and the Nazis in Europe. Not everybody. Some of them were hiding Jews and rescuing them, but a lot of them were in cahoots with the Nazis.
Right.
In fact, they say that they were instrumental in helping a lot of the Nazi officers escape Germany when they were being closed in on. The Catholic Church helped smuggle a lot of them out because they were indebted to them. But we can spend a lot of time.
Spicy.
It's funny. We can deal with all this, and YouTube won't even block it. It's funny. But if we deal with, the election was stolen, block you. Yeah. So anybody else comment, question?
When I was in Toledo, Spain, we saw a building that had been a church, a Catholic church, and then it had been Muslim, and went back and forth. But they still had the manacles screwed into the wall at the where they would hang people.
They let you see that?
It was right there. It was all there,
I
and they
mean,
told us that's what it was.
no kidding.
Yeah, Toledo, Spain.
Wow, did you take a picture?
Actually, I did, but I don't.
There are pictures online of some of the chambers and stuff.
I was remembering, I have this book called Fox's Book of Martyrs, and if you've never read that, it sounds like it would be really hard to read, but at the same time, all the stories of the faithful Christians who died for their faith, just amazing.
I have a brief comment. I have a very dear friend who is going to sound interesting, but they are spirit-filled, and they still attend the Catholic Church. And I asked him, why do you still go to the Catholic Church? And he said, when I walk in, I feel the reverence and fear of God, and I don't feel that when I walk in a Protestant church. And I thought that was an interesting comment, so I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and sometimes people will make that a comment similar to that when they want to maybe be a part of an Episcopal church or a Lutheran church or a Presbyterian church where they have some old traditions and motions and things that they do, so they feel that kind of affinity, reverence. So when I go in a Catholic cathedral, I've been in many of them, it's just, I don't feel any of those things at all. I just feel creepy. I was in one in Mexico, and I was there with Steve Corder, who's very loud and very unaware of his surroundings. And so there was a statue of Jesus, alleged Jesus, and he was bent over, and he was in a robe, and he had his thorns on, and he had his hands out like a beggarly, pathetic individual, right, who was wanting donations. See? And so they had the little can there. You could drop your donations in and stuff. The statue was probably 400 or 500 years old. And so Steve starts going on. And it's this empty cathedral, right? We think it's empty. And he starts going, you can hear it echoing all over the room. And he's going, look at this beggarly Jesus getting donations. This is not him. And he's going on and on about it, No wonder the priests were throwing bottles at us and stuff. We're handing out New Testaments, and that's very telling because they still have an attitude about the Bible. I'm telling you. They did not want us handing out New Testaments in their communities. They come out and start throwing stuff at us, and same spirit, still there.